Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. We are already on episode 7 of our MBA candidate series. Wow, we're moving right along. If you are loving this series, be sure to subscribe to our social media for some bonus content and some fun behind-the-scenes stuff. Today, we're going to be breaking down lean startups from this stack of articles and book excerpts you've given me. You've even got some cool case studies in here: Intuit, Groupon, even a mobile laundry service. And joining me to navigate this material is our expert. You always do such a great job of connecting all these different ideas and explaining the so what behind these really complex concepts.
Well, I think it's going to be fun to look at how lean startup principles, which are often associated with those fast-moving tech companies, can apply to these other businesses you mentioned. Some of them might seem pretty traditional.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess the first thing we need to address is the core problem that the lean startup methodology is trying to solve. It seems like traditional business planning just doesn't work when there's so much uncertainty, which startups definitely have. It's like trying to plan out a detailed itinerary for a trip when you don't even know where you're going.
I like that analogy. And Eric Ries, the author of The Lean Startup, he talks about this a lot. He argues that the old way of doing things, relying on detailed market analysis and 5-year financial projections and a rigid plan, it's like trying to perfectly tune a car engine before you've even checked to see if it will start. Startups need a way to steer, to constantly adjust their course as they learn more about their customers and the market.
So instead of trying to get everything perfect right from the start, it's more about validated learning. The story of IMVU, that avatar-based social network, really highlights this, I think. They initially built this instant messaging add-on because they thought it would be a huge hit, but it completely flopped.
Yeah, but what's interesting is that they didn't just give up. Instead, they started observing how people were actually using their platform. And what they saw was that users were creating these really elaborate profiles and spending hours customizing their avatars. That behavior, not their initial assumptions, and not even what users said they wanted, that's what led them to pivot to a standalone network that was focused on virtual identity and self-expression.
It's so interesting how they found their true value proposition. And it's a perfect example of how actionable metrics, the kind that track real user behavior, can be so much more valuable than vanity metrics like downloads or website visits.
No.
But I do have to ask, though, doesn't this emphasis on constant iteration and adaptation, could that potentially compromise product quality? Are we just encouraging people to put out half-baked products into the world?
Oh, that's a common misconception. The idea behind a minimum viable product, an MVP, it isn't about being sloppy. It's about testing your riskiest assumption as quickly as possible. Like, think about Groupon. They started with handmade PDFs and pizza coupons. It wasn't about having a beautiful website. It was about validating the core idea. Would people buy discounted deals if they were grouped together?
Okay, so it's not about launching a perfect product. It's about launching a product that helps you learn and give feedback. And speaking of feedback, one of the excerpts you shared talked about innovation accounting. Can you explain how that's different from traditional accounting and why it's so crucial for startups?
Yeah, so traditional accounting focuses on things like revenue and profit margins and return on investment. But those metrics don't really tell the whole story for a startup that's still figuring things out. Innovation accounting, though, is about measuring learning and progress. It's about tracking metrics that are tied to your core hypotheses, metrics that are auditable and accessible to everyone on the team.
The story of Grocket, the educational startup, really illustrates this point, I think. Initially, they were measuring things like the total number of users or how many questions were answered. They thought they were making progress, but something just wasn't clicking. What were they doing wrong?
Well, they were focusing on activity, not learning. What they really needed to figure out was whether their platform was actually helping students learn more effectively. So they started using split testing. They compared different versions of their product to see which ones actually led to improved learning outcomes. And that's when they started seeing real progress.
Okay, so it's about choosing the right metrics, the ones that actually measure progress towards your ultimate goal. Not just vanity metrics that make you feel good but don't actually tell you if you're on the right track. But what happens when those metrics aren't moving in the right direction? How do you know when to pivot, to change course, and when to persevere with your current strategy?
That's where the pivot comes in, being willing to change direction based on what you've learned. One of the articles you sent me talked about Votizen, a company that actually went through multiple pivots. First, they were focused on voter registration, then they shifted to voter turnout, and they finally landed on this platform for political advocacy.
I feel like a lot of founders would be really hesitant to pivot, kind of viewing it as admitting defeat or like starting all over again. But in Votizen's case, each pivot, it wasn't like completely abandoning their mission, was it? It was more like They were refining their approach based on what they were learning about their users and the market.
Exactly. Vodafone is a good example because they show that pivoting isn't starting over. It's about leveraging everything you've learned to iterate toward a better solution. Every pivot allowed them to test their assumptions more efficiently and get closer to product market fit. And that reminds me of another fascinating concept from the lean startup world, the idea of building an adaptive organization, one that's constantly learning and improving. One tool that can really help with this is the 5 whys technique.
Oh yeah, I've heard of this. Isn't it like incredibly simple? If you have a problem, instead of just jumping to solutions, you ask why 5 times to try to get to the root cause.
That's the basic idea. Let's say you're seeing a high rate of customer churn. Instead of throwing a bunch of marketing money at the problem, you might ask, why are customers leaving? The first answer could be, they're not finding our product valuable. But then you'd ask, why aren't they finding it valuable? And so on. You keep going, kind of peeling back the layers until you find a deeper, more systemic issue.
It's like that IMVU example, right? Where they used 5 whys to trace a server issue back to engineers who weren't properly trained, which really came from a managerial problem.
Right. It's a powerful technique because it forces you to look past just blaming individuals and instead look at the processes or cultural norms that might be contributing to the problem. And once you've identified the root cause, you can then invest proportionally to prevent that problem from happening again.
It's a much more proactive approach to solving problems. You're not just reacting to issues as they come up. You're trying to prevent them. I imagine that could be really helpful, not just for startups, but for any team or organization.
Oh, absolutely. 5 whys can be applied to any situation where you want to get to the bottom of a problem and create a more resilient system. But remember, it's not just about implementing a new tool, it's about creating a culture where everyone is constantly learning and trying to improve. And this leads us perfectly to Intuit, the company behind TurboTax and QuickBooks. They've done a great job of staying ahead of the curve and fostering innovation, even within a large and well-established organization. What really stands out to you about their approach?
Well, the article talked about how they created these dedicated teams and structures that are focused specifically on innovation. It's like they've carved out these islands of freedom where people can experiment and explore new ideas without being slowed down by all the bureaucracy that you see in larger companies.
That's a key point. Innovation teams need the space and resources to operate with some level of autonomy. They need their own budget and headcount, independent authority to actually build their business, and they need a personal stake in the outcome. Maybe it's through equity or bonuses or just the chance to lead a successful new venture.
The example of SnapTex was interesting, I thought. They basically built a startup within Intuit with its own team and budget and timeline, and they were able to move so fast they launched an MVP in just a few months. Do you think that kind of sandbox approach could be replicated in other types of organizations, or is it really just unique to the tech world?
I don't think it's limited to tech, but it does require certain conditions to be successful. These teams need resources, scarce but secure. They need freedom to make decisions and pivot their strategies without a ton of oversight, and they need a personal stake in the outcome. And it's really important to build a culture where experimentation is encouraged and failing is seen as a learning experience and not a mistake that ends your career. And it's not a one-time fix, it's an ongoing process that requires a lot of adapting as the team grows and gains more experience.
It seems like Intuit has also really mastered that balance between different types of work. They're fine-tuning their existing products, they're developing new areas for growth, and they're just sustaining a high level of operational excellence across everything they do. It's like they figured out how to juggle 3 balls at the same time without dropping any.
I like that. They're not just focusing on that disruptive innovation, they're also putting effort into those incremental improvements to their core products, and they're making sure that the foundation of the company is really solid. This whole portfolio approach is something that all leaders should be considering, whether they're at a startup or a Fortune 500 company. How do you actually manage this balance, though? How do you decide where to put your resources and talent?
One thing that came up in the material was the idea of categorizing work into 3 different buckets: tuning the engine of growth, developing new sources of growth, and then sustaining operational excellence. Can you maybe unpack these a bit more and explain how they work together?
Sure. Tuning the engine of growth, that's all about optimization. Making those incremental improvements to your products, business models, operations, trying to squeeze out as much value as possible. It's like fine-tuning a race car so you can get that extra edge on the track.
So it's really about efficiency, getting the most out of what you already have.
Yes, exactly. And then you have developing new sources of growth, and this is where that disruptive innovation comes in. It's about exploring uncharted territory, creating new markets, products, or business models that could have a huge impact on the future of the company. It's higher risk, higher reward, and usually involves a lot of experimentation and learning as you go.
Okay, so it's like investing in research and development or venturing into new markets. What about sustaining operational excellence? How does that fit in?
Sustaining operational excellence is really the foundation that allows the other two buckets to be successful. It's about making sure all the core functions of the business, everything from finance and HR to IT and customer service, are running efficiently and smoothly. Without that solid foundation, even the most innovative ideas can really struggle to gain traction.
I see. So it's not enough to just come up with new ideas. It's about creating an environment where those ideas can be implemented and scaled successfully. This portfolio approach, I mean, it seems like it would require a lot of flexibility and adaptability from leadership, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. Leaders have to be comfortable with not knowing everything, be willing to experiment, and they have to be able to make tough decisions about how to allocate resources. And they also need a clear vision for the future and a deep understanding of the company's strengths and weaknesses.
It's more than just tactics. It's a whole mindset. But even with the right mindset and structures in place, I'm curious, what happens when a really successful innovation project emerges from that sandbox environment? How do you integrate it back into the core organization without killing that momentum?
That's a really good question. It is tricky. You want to give them the support and resources they need to grow while also maintaining that agility and entrepreneurial spirit that made them successful in the first place.
So it's not just about absorbing them into the existing structure. It's about finding a way to integrate them while still allowing them to operate with some independence.
Right. One way to do this is to slowly expand the sandbox instead of moving them right into the company's standard way of operating. Maybe give them more resources, expand their customer base, or start integrating them more closely with other departments.
It's like a phased integration that allows the team and the organization to adjust without disrupting their progress. This brings up an interesting question, though. What happens to the original innovators? What role do they play once their project is fully integrated?
Ideally, they would get to take on new challenges. Maybe they'd lead new innovation projects or create new sandboxes for other people in the company who want to be entrepreneurs. It's about creating this cycle of constant innovation, rewarding the people who drive it, and building a culture where everyone feels empowered to take risks and push boundaries.
That sounds like an incredible environment to work in. But I'm curious, how do you stay ahead of the curve as an expert in this field? How do you make sure you're always learning and growing, especially in a space that's changing so quickly?
It's definitely a question I think about a lot. I think one thing that really helps is just embracing humility. You have to be willing to admit when you're wrong and to challenge your own assumptions, and most importantly, stay open to learning from others.
It's really all about having that growth mindset, right?
Hmm.
Recognizing that you can always learn more, and there are new ways to approach problems even when you're an expert.
Yeah, exactly. And it's important to remember that lean startup isn't like this strict set of rules. It's more like a set of guiding principles that you can adapt and apply to different situations and industries, which I think makes it really interesting.
It's about understanding those core concepts and using them as a framework for decision-making instead of blindly following a formula.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It really comes down to just being curious, always asking questions, seeking out new information and perspectives, and being willing to experiment.
That's what I love about our deep dives. It's a chance to explore those new ideas and really challenge how we think about things. But, I'd love to hear about some of the challenges that you've encountered when you've actually tried to put these principles into practice. I imagine there can be a lot of resistance to change, especially in big companies.
Well, you're absolutely right. Overcoming that resistance to change is one of the biggest challenges. People get comfortable with doing things a certain way, especially if it's worked for them in the past.
Right, which is understandable, but it can also prevent companies from growing and changing with the times.
Exactly. And in those situations, I've found that building relationships and trust is essential. You really have to take the time to understand people's concerns, show them that you're not trying to turn everything upside down overnight, and help them see how lean startup can actually help them get better results.
So it's about emphasizing the benefits and making sure everyone's on the same page instead of just forcing a new way of doing things on them.
Absolutely. And sometimes the best approach is to just start small, pick a project with low risk where you can show the value of experimenting and getting quick wins. Those early successes can really build momentum and get more people on board.
It's about showing them how it works, not just telling them. But what about when things don't go as planned? I mean, Lean Startup talks a lot about embracing failure, but that's got to be easier said than done sometimes, right?
Oh, of course. Failure can be tough, but it's really important to look at it as a learning opportunity. Instead of getting hung up on what went wrong, focus on getting those valuable insights out of it. What did you learn? How can you adjust your thinking? And what can you do differently next time?
It's about adopting that fail fast, learn fast mentality. And it sounds like creating an environment where everyone feels safe sharing those lessons so that the whole organization can benefit is really important.
Transparency is so important. When we try to hide our mistakes, we miss out on chances to improve. And in the end, that openness is what helps create a more adaptable and resilient organization.
Well said. Okay, let's zoom out for a second. What excites you the most about the potential of this whole lean startup movement? Where do you see it all going?
You know, what really gets me fired up is that this has the potential to really democratize innovation, to make it accessible to anyone, no matter what their background is or how many resources they have. The Lean Startup gives us a framework and a set of tools to build new things, whether it's a product, a service, even a community project, or a new way of working within a company.
It's about giving people the power to create change, to experiment, and to make a real difference.
That's exactly it. And that shift in thinking has the power to change not just companies, but whole industries and maybe even society as a whole.
Now, that's something worth striving for. You mentioned this idea of startup testing labs, where we could actually put different product development methodologies to the test. Can you tell me more about that? It sounds fascinating.
It's something I'm really passionate about. One of the challenges with studying innovation is that real-world startups are really complex. It's hard to isolate all the factors and measure the real impact of different approaches. These testing labs would be like a controlled environment where you could systematically compare different methodologies and figure out which factors consistently lead to success.
So you could have multiple teams, maybe with similar experience levels, give them the same problem to solve and the same resources, and then see which method works best, whether it's Agile, Lean Startup, or something else. It'd be like a scientific experiment for innovation.
Yeah, exactly. It would allow us to actually gather real data and insights that we could then share with entrepreneurs everywhere, which could help speed up innovation around the world.
That is an incredibly exciting prospect. It sounds like we're just beginning to tap into the potential of the Lean Startup.
Well, we have covered a ton of ground today, and I think our listeners have a lot to think about. Any final thoughts before we wrap things up? I'd just like to say again that Lean Startup is a journey, not a destination. It's about being okay with uncertainty, learning all the time, and never being afraid to experiment and try new things.
It's about being okay with not having all the answers right away and trusting the process of learning as you go to lead you to success. Well, I want to thank you again for taking us on this incredible deep dive into the world of lean startups. This has been such an eye-opening conversation. And for all our listeners, if you're interested in exploring more about business and innovation, make sure you check out our next episode in the MBA Candidate series. We'll be tackling another fascinating topic with a whole new set of sources. You definitely won't want to miss it.
It's always great to explore these topics with you and all our listeners.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time, keep learning and keep innovating.